Welcome. Thank you so much for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today to discuss the domestic extremist threat with Seamus Hughes. Seamus is the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. He's an expert on terrorism, homegrown violent extremism, and how to counter violent extremism. So we're thrilled to have him here with us today. Seamus, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
My name is Amanda Jolly, VP of Programs with the Council, and today's structure will kick off with a conversation with Seamus Hughes and Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. Today's episode of State of the World is sponsored by UConn Global, and we are so grateful for their support of this series, of the work of the World Affairs Council, and for making community conversations around global issues possible. So we are honored to have Seamus here today to discuss the threat of domestic extremism, its motivations, its roots, and how it can be combated. So let's get started. I'm pleased to turn it over to you, Megan. Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. There is so much to get to, so I really just want to get started. Seamus, so on January 6th of this year, the attack, the violent insurrection on the United States Capitol woke us up as a nation to the threat of domestic extremism and domestic terrorism. Can you kind of set the scene for us? Who were these individuals that attacked the Capitol? Are they outliers or are they representative of the larger threat we're facing as a nation? And, the larger threat of domestic extremism here in the US?
First of all, let me say thank you to the World Affairs Council for having me. I spent my formative years after college in Connecticut, in Stamford and Bridgeport, and my wife's grandmother is in West Hartford, all 92 years old, who got her vaccine last week. So it's always good to be a part of this. So let's turn to a more sober conversation, which is domestic terrorism. So if you look at January 6th, think of it like a bug light. It attracted all forms of domestic extremists. And so this is a relatively timely conversation because just yesterday we put out a report looking at everyone who was arrested at a federal level for charges on January 6th. It's about 300 folks so far, and the investigation's ongoing. The FBI director has testified yesterday that they got 250,000 tips from the public. But if you pull back the curtain of the folks who traveled, who got and broke into the Capitol, there's a spectrum, right? On one side of the spectrum, you have militias like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. These are more organized groups with command and control and hierarchy. They tended to be former military folks or have some sort of operational background. Then you had a pretty good cluster of folks who, what we called as clustered networks. These are folks that travel with their friends, families, husband and wives to the group. And then finally, the largest category of the 300 folks who've been charged and arrested are what we term as inspired believers. These are folks that don't have an operational connection to groups, didn't have any friends, but were drawn to the movement. And so, like I said, it was a bug light. January 6th went out and everybody came in, and it gave you a sense of what you're talking about on the spectrum of domestic terrorism, from the very well prepared to the kind of merely curious who take selfies in front of a George Washington bust at the Senate Rotunda, right? And there's a different range of support, whether it be folks that brought in, walkie-talkies and hid their guns outside, to others who, smoked weed on the Capitol grounds and got arrested for that. So when we're talking about the look at January 6th, it is very much a hodgepodge, basically an island of misfit toys. Concerning, right? But it was almost a unifying event, similar to like a Ruby Ridge or a Waco, right? It's going to live in folklore for some time.
We sometimes hear that in the United States, extremism is a problem across the political and ideological spectrum. Can you describe the landscape for us? Is extremism a far left problem? Is it a far right problem? Is it both?
Yeah, it's an equal opportunity problem. The FBI director yesterday testified for the Senate Judiciary Committee. When he started as the FBI director, they had 850 domestic terrorism investigations open at any given time. Yesterday, he testified they have 2,000 open investigations. So the numbers are rising steadily, but it comes from all different political spectrums. Obviously, the vast majority, when you look at the cases, are white supremacist and anti-government movements, but you do also see far left anarchist movements, everything in between, single issue, folks that are upset about COVID lockdowns, to everything in between. So you got to think of domestic terrorism. It's a term of art in government. And I spent a good amount of time in the intelligence community. When you say domestic terrorism, it doesn't just mean white supremacists. It doesn't just mean far right. It doesn't mean far left. It means everything. And so it's a catch-all phrase for a lot of this. And the way we approach domestic terrorism is much different in terms of laws and responsibilities and resources than we do, say, international terrorism. So cases of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There's different laws in the books. There's different approaches to it. And so it's in very way a kaleidoscope of extremism, a mosaic you got to kind of put together.
So, in the post 9/11 world, the United States was so focused on fighting terrorism abroad. How do you think sort of the domestic terrorism landscape has changed since 9/11? Have we as Americans changed our perception on terrorism?
Well, I think January 6th was an eye-opening event for a number of people. But if you'd been watching this for decades, you realize that all the lights were blinking red for quite a while. And when you look at domestic terrorism in the U.S., there is a good number of folks who are organized, has a leadership structure, is training at 100 acres in a town in Georgia, shooting guns and hanging out with 10 of their friends. Whereas when you look at international terrorism, they tended to be folks, ones and twos of people, so not large numbers of individuals. So in many ways, there's an organizational structure for domestic terrorism that there wasn't for international terrorism supporters in the US. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing because it's easy if you're the FBI to put together your cork board with your yarn and figure out the organizational structure and then starting arresting folks. It's a bad thing because they've relatively had a freedom of movement that groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda haven't had in the U.S.
So if we're looking across the spectrum, across the United States at domestic terrorists, what are some of the most prominent sort of groups, and where are they in the United States?
Yeah, all over, unfortunately. And I don't want to be alarmist, right? You got to put this in context. You're talking about 2,000 active investigations in a population size of 330 million. So a relatively reasonable number of things. But you're talking about the traditional kind of KKK, white supremacist, neo-Nazi type of groups, but an increasing number of what we would term as anti-government movements. And so these are people that are see government as an overreach, as infringing on First Amendment or Second Amendment rights, and are rallying around that. And then we can't discount the role of the internet into this whole conversation. So we had a number of folks that showed up on January 6th that were drawn to this idea of QAnon. An individual they believed was telling them the prophecy of what was happening in the U.S. and they needed to help stop that. And so the role of social media to connect all these folks in a way they hadn't before, it was a little bit harder in 10 years ago or 15 years ago when you were a big fan of white supremacy to find other people that were fans of white supremacy in your town. You can now make that leap online and then connect.
So when we're looking at who is vulnerable, to recruitment, how would you describe who is the most vulnerable to recruitment by domestic terrorism groups?
I think there's a spectrum. I would say if I've spent my career looking at both ISIS cases and domestic terrorism cases. For the ISIS cases, for international terrorism, they tend to be younger folks, 20-year-old, 21-year-old, impressionable youth. When you look at domestic terrorism cases, they tend to be on the older spectrum. In fact, when you look at the cases of individuals who charged on January 6th, the average age is 39. And for the women in the data set, the average age is 45. So it almost seems like a second act in many ways, right? These are folks that are prone to believe conspiracies. These are folks that want to have a sense of belonging, and these groups provide some level of it. I should note that if anyone ever tells you here's a profile of a domestic terrorist and here's the top 10 list they need to check, and if you get that top 10 list, that person's going to be a domestic terrorist, kick them out of the room immediately because there isn't one, right? You wish as a law enforcement officer or a psychologist or things like that you had that checklist, but people by their very nature are complex, all right? And the reason why they join domestic terrorist groups, domestic extremist groups, is equally as complex. And so I wish it was an easier process, but it's just not.
I want to bring in an audience question. So with this last year, so many of us working from home, spending so much time on our screens, has COVID increased recruitment by domestic terrorism groups?
Yes and no. And that's a typical academic answer, but let me explain it, right? So yes, in terms of more people spending time online, they're getting down a rabbit hole of conspiracies, right? And yes, because COVID in many ways kind of reinforced a narrative that had already been out there for anti-government groups, which is government overreach, right? They've enforced lockdowns. And so as such, government can't do that. They're infringing on our rights. We have to push back on that. In fact, when you saw the rallies against lockdowns around this country, there was obviously a number of people that had legitimate concerns about the role of lockdowns. But then you saw anti-government groups and members try to co-opt that movement and reinforce what they saw as the beliefs. Now, here's the no on that question. Megan, you and I are more likely joining a domestic extremism group if I know you in person, right? So social media obviously matters, and the online environment obviously matters. But like most things, you're more likely to commit a violent act if you think your best friend thinks that violent act is okay too, right? And so having that in-person recruitment matters a great deal. And so there was a limiting, obviously, given the nature of the virus, of in-person networks and recruitment. So that did diminish in some ways, but I think it's offset by the role of social media.
So when we're looking at, again, who's vulnerable to domestic extremism, we have been hearing a lot about recruitment in law enforcement, recruitment within our military. In fact, I think that the Pentagon released a report last week about recruitment within the military and within our veterans. Can you speak to why extremist groups may be targeting law enforcement, military, veterans should join them?
Yeah, a lot of this is because they provide some skill set that they don't have in their own group, right? So if you look at January 6th, we had 36 veterans who were arrested for federal charges. Those primarily came from groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And so if you were part of an organization, a domestic extremism organization, you tended to have a military background. So why are they recruiting them? And it is an active recruitment, right? It's flyers at bases and things like that. It's because they have a skill set, right? If you believe that the US government is going to take over and infringe on your rights, then it helps to have somebody who spent 10 years at special forces to know how to fight back to a tyrannical government. So there is an active recruitment on that. And then law enforcement, we've had a few cases out of the January 6th case, but obviously given the nature of how large law enforcement is here, we've got 26,000 law enforcement agencies around the country. You're going to have some subset of people that are drawn to it.
So one of the tools that we have to combat extremism is policy and creating policy.
Yep.
But as we've seen, there are some policymakers and elected officials in the US who have sort of embraced and normalized extremist views and welcomed extremist views, into their tent. So some might say, how does this sort of hinder the effort to combat extremism?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's hard to say that something is extreme if most of your political leaders believe it too. And so there is something to be said about not normalizing the fringe. And if you bring it into the fringe, it stops becoming the fringe. A perfect example of that would be a group like Proud Boys or the Boogaloos, kind of a unique type of groups. The more that politicians were talking about it, and increasingly the more the media was talking about it, the greater their ranks grew. So when they announced a rally in Seattle, it had 4 or 5 people, but there was a front page story in most major newspapers about the Proud Boys, and damned if they didn't double their membership overnight because of it. And so there's a balancing act between informing the public about what you're concerned about and not rising these folks into a level that they haven't before. Obviously, you would hope for elected officials to tamp down on the fringes, but barring that from happening, it kind of falls on civil society to do so.
I want to bring in an audience question about what happened on January 6th. So I know that Director Wray testified yesterday. Is there any evidence that the people that were at the Capitol on January 6th were pretending to be Trump supporters? What do you say when people say that?
Yep.
What
So the
evidence?
FBI director was explicit yesterday that they have no evidence of folks kind of pretending to be supporters of the former president. In fact, when you look at the criminal complaints, so on our website, which is extremism.gwu.edu, we put together a database of everyone who's been arrested. And that includes hundreds of pages of legal documents that the public can access. If you go through those legal documents, you see a number of cases where individuals were pushing back on that narrative. So they would storm the Capitol or get in the Capitol, and they would get pinged from their friends saying, "Oh, that wasn't you. It was really the far left, pretending to be you." And then they would push back and say, "No, actually, it was completely us. We wanted to stop the steal. It's important to do that." And so we haven't seen any evidence of that. This is not to discount, and I think it's important to say, this is not to discount what's happening in Portland or at the courthouses there or other things like that. There clearly is a good strand and an important concerning strand of far left extremism in this country. But for the narrow question of January 6th, largely a far right movement.
So one of the things, and we do have an audience question about this, we oftentimes hear that, what happened at the Capitol on January 6th was terrible, but there were also protests around the United States during 2020. So John wants to know, so are those assaults of state and local federal facilities during the entire year of 2020 being investigated with the same intensity as those were on January 6th?
Yeah, I think that January 6th was clearly a different standard in terms of law enforcement approach, just given the nature that it's an attacking a co-equal branch of government. And so there was a push of all law enforcement on there. This is not to say the FBI has ignored other threats. In fact, they talked about some 400 investigations they have ongoing as it relates to anarchist and far left movements. There's been about 1,000 folks who've been charged and arrested connected to the protest over the summer, but a particular focus on attacks like that happened at the Portland courthouse and Molotov cocktails and the murder by an anarchist of a counter protester. And so the FBI would say they're ideologically agnostic as long as it's violence. We're going to look at it. Obviously, you're going to have to balance the two in terms of resources. If you have 10 agents, do you put 9 against this form of extremism and 1 against that? And does that tell you something? Probably. But I think there's an understanding that there is going to be a rebalancing. The last point I would note, and I think we can't get lost in this, is I really like as an academic to bucket things, right? So blue goes into the blue cup and the red goes in the red cup, and then I know it, right? Unfortunately, domestic extremism doesn't allow for it that much, right? So you see folks that will have a blended ideology. They'll be Proud Boys, but not white supremacists, or white supremacists and Proud Boys, or they'll be involuntary celibates, but also anti-government extremists, or not, right? And so you're seeing a blending of ideologies in a way we hadn't seen before. A lot of folks just like to watch the world burn, and we can't discount that. But if you're trying to bucket everything as we've had 1,000 active investigations in anti-government extremism, you may miss the fact that half of them are also white supremacist, or half of them are not white supremacist, right? There's a level of nuance, which I know I'm naive to think that in 2021, but a level of nuance that is needed on this.
So let's talk a little bit about the global impact that the United States has on the rest of the world and domestic terrorism might have on the rest of the world. In an interview with the ADL, you stated that we're exporting our hate. Can you explain what you meant by that? Are domestic extremists here in the United States spreading hate and extremism around the world?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think, unlike, say, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, where a foreign ideology came here and was recruiting Americans, in this scenario, we're seeing a domestic extremism ideology that's exporting its beliefs out elsewhere. And what do I mean by that? You're seeing travel from Americans to places like the Ukraine to join far-right groups there, the Azra Battalion and other places like that. You're seeing transfer of money, transfer of propaganda and ideology. the networks and the infrastructure for the online space is largely based in the US. And so we're in many ways kind of pushing out our stuff. There's a reason why you see a Proud Boys chapter in Scotland, right, which started in the US. And so there is some, unfortunately, just the interconnectivity of the world will mean that we're going to push out more.
So you also wrote a book on American supporters of ISIS. So are Americans involved in jihadist activity abroad significantly comparable to homegrown extremists here? That's a question from Caroline.
Yes. And so I'm old enough to think that we can chew gum and walk at the same time, right? You should be concerned about the Nidal Hassans of the world that committed the Fort Hood attack as much as you are the Dylan Roofs of the world. And unfortunately, if you're the law enforcement, the intelligence community, you can't just sleep on one side and not ignore the others. And so obviously that the height of ISIS, when they controlled large swaths of territory the size of the United Kingdom, they were recruiting at a larger clip than they are now. But we still see, in fact, in Connecticut, we still see a number of cases coming out of Connecticut of folks that are trying to travel to Syria and Iraq. And so it's unfortunately a busy time for law enforcement.
When we're looking at this issue globally, or just even domestically, when we're looking at the roots of recruitment into violent extremist groups, what would you say are some of the root causes?
For the ideology, or just the reason why people are recruited?
Both.
Okay, so I mean, there's clearly a decades-long histories of white supremacy that we need to address, and has its roots in this. For the anti-government movement has been around for quite a while. Think of Ruby Ridge and Waco, and so there's always been a strand of contrarianism is the wrong word, but some sort of strand of contrarianism when it comes to anti-government movements. And then white supremacy has veered off into very different organizations, but has always been present in some form, whether it be larger or smaller in the US. And so that's going to stick with us for some time. And a level of soul searching is probably needed to address it.
When we are looking at how we combat domestic extremism, one of those things that we've heard is that it is far more easier to prosecute a foreign terrorist than it is a domestic terrorist. What are some of the policy recommendations that you would have for us going forward?
So there's this question, right? So you have this domestic terrorism statute. So if you're for international terrorism, if you drive to Bradley Airport and you're going to go join the Islamic State, you can be arrested for material support. The material being yourself, right? If you're a white supremacist and you're going to drive to Ukraine and join a group over there, you can actually be arrested for material support because there's not a equivalent charge in the domestic scene. Now, we can address that, but given my past life as a campaign political operative guy, I would tell you that the prospects of that passing the House or the Senate is zero on a good day. Because there's always a concern that government, whether it be whether you fall on the Trump, the Biden, or anywhere in between, that depending on the administration, a domestic terrorism law will be used against folks they disagree with. Right? So let's put that aside for a moment. It may be the way to go on things, but it's not going to happen. What are the things you could do kind of immediately? First and foremost, we have to get more information on the number of arrests and active investigations for the FBI. So the FBI director says 2,000 active investigations, but I don't know what the hell that means, right? Does it mean 800 investigations for white supremacists and 400 for far left extremists, 100 for anti-abortion extremists? And so we need some level of clarity because domestic terrorism is a catch-all phrase. The other thing we may want to look at is, after 9/11, we set up a center called the National Counterterrorism Center. It looks and trades information as it relates to international terrorism and brings in 16 different agencies to look at all the information. It is narrowly focused on international terrorism. We may want to expand its mandate to domestic terrorism. Two other things to look at, because I know we're hitting against time. One is, we talked about this, the role of military on domestic extremism. The FBI warned Department of Defense 60 times last year that they had an active investigation on their individuals, right? And so clearly a problem, but we can expand the reporting requirements so that DOD knows that, John that's getting on the base is under active investigation for being part of, a neo-Nazi group. Okay, well, DOD may limit his ability to have a gun on base for that day, right? And so there's a level of information. The last thing I would note is there's a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and just general misunderstanding of what happened on January 6th. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm generally dispassionate and I hate politics, right? So those two things together, I would like a dispassionate and hate politics type of approach to a national commission as it relates to January 6th, right? Get through the noise. Who knew what warnings were out there? What was the nature of what happened? And what do we do to address the systematic issues that seem to be failing? Because there was obviously warnings at the FBI and other places that things were happening, and they just weren't heeded. And so is that a failure of government, or is this just the nature of what we're dealing with on extremism? So a commission wouldn't be bad pretty quickly.
So right before we close, I want to ask you a question about technology and the role of technology companies.
Yep.
So we know that technology companies have a large role to play. And recently they've been sort of kicking extremists and extremist recruiters offline. Is this an effective response? What is the next step? Where do those extremists go when they're deplatformed?
Yeah, there's two issues, right? One is deplatforming, so removing people off their platforms does work. If you look at a purely technical standpoint, if you have 1,000 followers on Twitter and you get kicked off, if you go to another platform, you're not going to have 1,000 anymore. You're probably going to have half, right? So from a narrow perspective, it does work, and you're less likely to get the fence sitters and the merely curious if they're off the mainstream sites. Here's my caveat to that. There should be a great debate whether the role of technology companies to decide that, right? Who owns the public forum? Are these utilities? And so who gets to determine what is okay on their platforms? And so I would be concerned of technology companies taking an inherently governmental function of counterterrorism and policing their own stuff somewhere. So there's two options. The other thing is, once they get off mainstream platforms from Facebook to Google to Microsoft, other places, they end up on fringe platforms. Those fringe platforms don't tend to respond to FBI subpoenas of information. They don't tend to do content moderation and remove content. They don't tend to be particularly responsive to other concerns, right? So you may reduce the radicalization pool, so the number of people that are drawn to it and see that message, but the mobilization pool, the folks that are going to commit a violent act, may be strengthened and get deeper because they're only talking to the folks they want to talk to, right? It's an echo chamber online. And so we as a society have to decide what's our level of acceptance of extremism on our public forums.
So one last question, as a civil society organization, the World Affairs Council sort of, really tries to encourage dialogue. Are there things that we as community leaders can do to sort of encourage moderation, to help combat extremism besides conversations like this? How do we reach those that we're not reaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things, right? So you can do kind of the internet safety approach to kind of alert your children and grandchildren about the dangers online. Particularly when it comes to QAnon, where it's very easy for someone to go down a rabbit hole and come out, 2 weeks later, believing the most asinine things, right? So there's a role for informing the public on this. We can't also discount, I'm less likely to hate you, Megan, if I know you in real life, right? If I know who you are, what you do, if you play, softball on a Saturday, right? So there's something to be said about demystifying our neighbors, right? And getting a sense of that. So a level of interfaith connections is always warranted on these type of things. Internet safety, it is a tired and lazy saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. See something, say something is important in this scenario. If you look at the cases of January 6th, the vast majority of folks who are arrested were turned in by bystanders. So people saw something that was concerning, didn't really know what to do with it, and kind of just let it lie. And so instead of letting it lie, reach out so that your loved one doesn't end up behind a jail cell for the next 10 years, right? So there are off-ramps that we can provide to folks, but we just have to be willing to do so.
Excellent. Seamus, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fantastic conversation. And I want to let you know that this is probably the most questions that we've received. So apologies to those that I didn't get their questions. We're just going to have Seamus back on State of the World again.
Yeah, I would say, listen, I'm going to regret this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. My contact information is on our website, extremism.gwu.edu. If you have any questions I haven't gotten to, just shoot me a note and I'll call you. I feel indebted to the state of Connecticut to do so. So you've got me out of college. So the very least I could do is that. So I really do appreciate you having me. But we aim to be a resource at the George Washington Program on Extremism. And so it's incumbent on us to respond to requests from the public and things like that. So feel free to ping me.
Thank you so much, Seamus.
Well, thank you, Seamus, and thank you for that generous offer. We'll make sure everyone gets that link too, so they can follow up. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. While we wait, I'll close out this portion with a huge thank you to our conversation sponsor today, Yukon Global. Thank you for your support of State of the World, and thank you for making programs like this possible. This discussion is an event of the State of the World series. So coming up, we'll tackle everything from global movements for civil rights to China's new digital currency, and from crises in the Horn of Africa to the argument that this period of the world might just be the storm before the calm. So we invite you to join us next week when we'll speak with Ambassador Derek Mitchell on the coup in Myanmar and global threats to democracy. So to make sure you don't miss an episode, visit our website at ctwac.org, subscribe to our YouTube channel at World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and subscribe to our State of the World podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, thank you so much to Seamus. Thank you for sharing your leadership with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Seamus.